My roommate had a restraining order against her ex. He broke her window. He knew exactly where she slept. Then he hid in her closet. For hours. When she opened the door, he was just standing there, staring. And all he said was, "I just want my vape back." That's when she texted me. 45 seconds later, I was calling 911. This happened in the fall of 2025 while I was on a sales trip through a small town in Missouri. I had spent the entire day driving throughout the northwest region of the state, visiting more than 60 sales leads. By the time I returned to my hotel that evening, I was mentally exhausted. Even so, I still had work to finish, so I spent several hours on my laptop scheduling emails to send the following morning. The hotel was a normal mid-tier place. It wasn't a chain, but it also wasn't a budget motel. It had a Western log cabin aesthetic and felt surprisingly cozy. From the moment I checked in until the following morning, I never saw another guest on my floor. That detail becomes important later. I was staying on the third floor, which was also the top floor. Around 11:30 p.m., I was sitting at the desk, typing away when I heard activity in the hallway. There were footsteps, a door opening, and a few urgent voices. I didn't think much of it. Hotels are noisy places, and guests come and go at all hours. About 15 minutes later, I decided to go downstairs to buy a bottle of water from the vending machine. As soon as I stepped into the hallway, I noticed a gurney positioned halfway inside a room 3 doors down. 2 EMTs stood in the doorway while a man who appeared to be in his 60s lay on the stretcher. I couldn't see his face, only part of his arm and torso. Assuming it was a routine medical emergency, such as a fall or illness, I chose not to stare and quietly returned to my room. 10 minutes later, I stepped back into the hallway to finally get my water. This time, the gurney was completely in the hallway. One EMT was performing aggressive chest compressions, while the other stared at a portable heart monitor. I heard the unmistakable continuous flatline tone. That was the moment I realized the man was either dying or had just died. The EMT monitoring the machine firmly instructed me to return to my room, so I did. When I stepped inside, the clock read 12:18 a.m. Even after witnessing what had happened, my mind remained restless, and I continued working for another half hour before finally climbing into bed around 12:50. Only a few minutes later, I heard what sounded like 3 soft knocks on my hotel room door. They weren't loud enough for me to be certain they were even knocks. I assumed it was the building settling or plumbing noises, so I ignored them. Less than a minute later, I heard the exact pattern again. 3 knocks, but louder. I got out of bed and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. As I stepped away from the door, preparing to return to my bed, I noticed the handle slowly depress, not violently, just enough to suggest someone was gently testing whether the door was locked. At that moment, a feeling came over me unlike anything I'd ever experienced. I stared at the peephole but couldn't bring myself to look through it. Instead, my attention shifted to the strip of light beneath the door. The light suddenly disappeared. It looked exactly as though someone or something was standing directly outside my room. The darkness remained for several seconds. Then the light returned. Immediately after, I heard a faint brushing sound against the outside of the door, almost like someone slowly dragging their fingers or the side of an arm across it. Then everything went silent. Despite legally carrying a firearm while traveling, I was frozen with fear. I had never experienced such an overwhelming dread before. I turned on one of the lamps and spent the next hour sitting awake in bed watching YouTube videos, hoping to distract myself. Eventually, I heard another noise in the hallway. A door opened. It sounded like it came from the same room where the EMTs had treated the man earlier. Then, I heard someone quietly muttering to themselves. The words were too faint to understand. Feeling relieved that another guest was awake, I finally opened my door. A man was stepping out of that same room. He wasn't dressed like hotel staff or an EMT. Instead, he wore dark slacks and a white button-down shirt, like someone traveling for business. He appeared to be in his mid-40s. The only thing that stood out to me was his eyes. They looked unusually sunken, as though he hadn't slept in months. Curiously, I stepped into the hallway and asked if he had been with the man taken away by the emergency services earlier. The man turned to face me. After a couple seconds of silence, he nodded. He then stated that there had been 3 knocks and that the third time was when they answered. I was confused, so I asked what he meant. A small smile crossed his face before he calmly replied that they didn't always leave immediately. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the stairwell. Needless to say, I got very little sleep that night. The following morning, around 8:30, exhausted and still trying to make sense of everything, I went downstairs to grab some coffee. I stopped at the front desk and asked the woman working there about the medical emergency from the night before. She looked genuinely confused and said she didn't know what incident I was referring to. I explained that paramedics had taken a man out of the room 3 doors down from mine and had been performing CPR in the hallway. As I continued explaining, she seemed more interested, but informed me that the room I was describing had been vacant. According to her, the last registered guest had checked out the previous day, and that guest had checked in alone. She also mentioned that the hotel occupancy had been unusually low the past few weeks, and that only a handful of guests had been staying on my floor, all of them at the opposite end of the hallway. She then asked me to confirm that the room I was talking about was exactly 3 doors down from room 312. That was when everything suddenly connected in my mind. The incident happened 3 doors away. My room number was 312. The knocking had always come in groups of 3. And the mysterious man's first statement had been that there had been 3 knocks and that the third time was when they answered. It was one of the most unsettling moments of realization I've ever experienced. It felt as though I was standing in the middle of something that simply didn't make sense. I spent countless hours trying to explain every part of what happened. Even though the front desk employee insisted nobody matching that man's description was staying there, she had only started her shift that morning. Maybe she simply didn't know who had been there overnight. Maybe someone forgot to tell her about the medical emergency. Maybe hotel policy prevented her from discussing it. Maybe the strange man was simply another guest who decided to play an incredibly cruel joke on me. Maybe the knocking had just been normal building noises. Or the handle never actually moved, and exhaustion after a long day of driving and hours of staring at a computer screen caused me to imagine it. Maybe the hallway light briefly dimmed because of an electrical issue. I even question whether the entire experience had been some unusually vivid dream brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. But no matter how many explanations I come up with, none of them account for every detail. What bothers me more than anything is how everything seemed connected by the number 3. For nearly 3 weeks afterward, I wasn't myself. My mood was different. And if anyone asked what was wrong, I simply blamed work, stress, and a few personal things. I didn't want this story to be the thing that convinced everyone else I had been losing my mind. Thankfully, as time passed, I was eventually able to move on for the most part. Although, I still don't like thinking about it for too long. I still travel frequently for work, and thankfully, nothing remotely similar has ever happened again. In fact, the morning after everything occurred, once I finished speaking with the front desk employee, I packed my things and left the hotel as quickly as I could. While checking out, nothing else unusual happened, and I even noticed several completely normal guests staying at the opposite end of my floor. Even so, ever since that trip, I've developed a strange habit whenever I check into a hotel. Almost without thinking, I immediately count how many doors separate my room from the stairwell and pay attention to any room numbers or locations involving the number 3. Although the knocking that night always came in patterns of 3, it only happened twice. And that's the one thing I still find myself strangely grateful for. Because if I ever hear a third set of 3 knocks outside my hotel room door someday, I won't be sticking around long enough to find out what answers. The ex-boyfriend in the closet. This story mainly happened to my roommate Misty, but I was involved. All names except for mine have been changed. This happened literal hours before I'm typing this. My roommate, who I'll call Misty, had a boyfriend named Paul, whom I've met a couple times. Every time I met him, he seemed like a very chill, respectable, and actually kind of sweet guy. He would roll blunts for me and Misty because neither of us knew how, and we would talk about video games we liked. However, a couple of weeks ago, they broke up, and according to her, it didn't end well. She had to get a restraining order on him. Flash forward to 2 nights ago. I was playing SWAT 4 on my laptop when I got the most normal-sounding knock on my door. I said, "Come in," barely looking away from the screen, when Misty slowly opens my door and says in a mumbled, quiet and almost drunk-sounding voice, "Paul broke my window and threw my clothes inside. Can you help me?" I could barely make out what she said. I paused my game, got up, and came closer to hear her clearly. She seemed like she had just woken up from a deep sleep after drinking a bit. She explained to me that her ex Paul had smashed her window in and thrown a bag of dirty clothes she left at his house. Mind you, she has one of those bunk beds that has a little office space underneath it instead of another bed, and it's right next to the window he smashed in. He knew exactly where she sleeps. So it was kind of scary to hear her tell me that. But I'm a bigger guy, and I know how to fight. He's a skinny but kind of muscular man. I wasn't afraid of him at all, just scared for her safety. So I reassured her that I would stay up and call the cops and make sure he was gone. After calling the cops, I stood out on the porch scanning the parking lot and the neighborhood street, but I didn't see anyone. However, I couldn't shake that creepy feeling of being watched, so I told her to stay inside. About 45 minutes went by, and no cops showed up. So I called the police department number to see if they were sending a car. They said we were second on the call list and that it was a busy night for them, which tracks for the city and area I'm in. While waiting for the cops, Misty was getting texts from Paul saying things like, "Wrong move, bitch," and "I want my vape back," which she didn't have and couldn't find. So we think he was lying about that. It took another 3 hours for a cop to arrive, and it was 3:00 inches the morning by that point. But the cop was nice and took all the info we could give him. He said if Paul came back to give them a call and that they would go to his address that they have on file because of the previously mentioned restraining order. Flash forward to yesterday, just before I left for work. I had a gut feeling he would try to come back before I got home because I had to close at my job and it would be dark out. At about 10:48 p.m, I got a text confirming my suspicion. The next bit of the story all happened to Misty as I was at work. At about 10:30, she left her room to go take some trash out. When she looked back, she saw a dark figure walk into her room. Paul does have dark skin, but Misty is a little crazy, she will admit, and I do mean that with endearment. She slightly brushed it off as her seeing things. But she still went and looked around the apartment for Paul or anyone who shouldn't be there and couldn't find anyone. So she just sat down in her room and scrolled on her phone for a bit until she decided to get up and get some cleaning supplies from her closet. But when she opened the closet door, staring right at her was Paul with a blank expression. Misty said she went white with fear but kept her cool and talked to him like normal and asked what he wanted. In a dead cold voice he said, "I just want my vape back," while she frantically but calmly, so as to not raise suspicion, sent me texts. By some miracle, 45 seconds after that text exchange, my manager said I could go home early since it was slow. I bolted out of my job, called 911 and got on the bus. I told the operator everything that was happening, and by the time I got home, the police had already got him in cuffs. By then, Misty had left to go to a friend's house to chill out after that, but she told me everything that happened, and I was shook when she told me. When the cop asked me what happened, and when I got to her side, even his eyes widened, and even he was taken aback by the situation. He gave me another incident report and said he's definitely going to jail. I'm happy my friend's okay, and shout out to her for being so calm and thinking on her feet, and shout out to my manager for letting me get off early. I still would have called 911 from work if I had to, but it was better for my anxiety to go home as that was unfolding.